This is actually an approach I took when I was teaching software design, which from the right angle is not that different from story design, or at least from my twisted angle. They're almost the same thing, which is why the techniques I've been using to design software for now 30 years became really good modeling techniques for designing stories and also for analyzing stories. Today, we will actually be working more on analyzing than designing, because I figure that's a good way to let everybody see how it works in the scope of an existing work that some of you may be familiar with. We're here for your questions. We're not here for me to just draw these pictures. I already drew them Friday night as a test run, and I don't really need to draw them again. We are here for your questions of my thought processes as I draw them. So you should not hesitate to unmute and speak up, to put questions in the chat. You should not in the slightest hesitate to be a participant, not just an observer, but participation is, again, voluntary, not mandatory. So I will be putting together an analysis of an existing story, a visual analysis, a graphical analysis, using techniques to identify elements within the story and to capture them, and then to spark discussion of them. I will be doing this with a UML tool, which is a software design tool, because it's a tool, A, I own already, and B, I know really well, so it's a natural way for me to do this. I will tell you up front that the tool, which I think is a wonderful tool and worth every penny, that every penny is $229. Should you say, I'm not a software developer, so I don't need that tool, I entirely understand, and there are lots of other choices in tools. They just don't have the features and the way of working that I already know so well. So I will happily share the link if you are interested, but I have it for my day job. I use it for my night job. I'm not sure how many people are going to want to have it for their night job. Let us get started here with a couple of comments. Some of you have heard me give these remarks before in terms of my approach to writing advice: tools, not rules. I think anytime somebody gives you the rules you have to follow for writing, they are either mistaken or they're trying to sell you something. Because any rule you can name, I can find a dozen successful stories that broke it. What happens, however, is when you are new, a rule sounds like certainty, and you crave certainty, you crave some guidance. And so things often get couched as rules. And I like to use a metaphor of traveling in the woods. And that there are these levels of comprehension of traveling in the woods. And level 0, you are wandering, you are lost. If you see a stream, you drink from it because you're thirsty. If you see a mushroom, you eat it because you're hungry and you hope they're not poison. And if you see a light, you follow it because you want to get somewhere, and you just want to get through these woods and you don't know where you're going. That's wandering. Level 1 is following. Somebody puts you on a path and says, if you follow this, you will come out the other side. And here are the streams you can drink from, and here are the mushrooms you can eat. And if you follow this, you will get through to the other side of exactly where I told you to go. But what if that's not where you wanted to go? Or what if it was taking a really long time, so you decided that looked like a shortcut you might take, and so you veered off of it, and now you're wandering again? Following feels like safety because somebody has shown you this will get you to a place. But that's still level 1. Level 2 is navigating. They hand you a map of all sorts of trails through these woods and all the places they lead and hazards you might run into along the way, and you get to make choices. Level 3 is trailblazing. You know how to figure out where the trails are in the woods. You've been through the woods so many times that you can make new trails. You can figure out things that nobody ever thought of before. The problem there is level 3 sounds an awful lot like wandering to a wanderer, because the wanderer doesn't have the 20 years of experience. So the wanderer, I mean, when you're a trailblazer, here is essentially the answer to all problems. Look at your goals, look at your resources, look at your constraints, figure out how you're going to meet your goals with those tools within those constraints. That's not a plan. That's a, I've seen something like this before. It's not helpful to wanderers. And the other problem with these different levels is when you have conversations across levels. So you get one person saying, this is the one true path. Another person comes along and says, no, that's a path, but there are some other paths. And now you've got that discussion back and forth, and you've got the poor wanderer sitting there saying, who do I listen to? Who do I believe? So sometimes these conversations cross levels, that you get two trailblazers talking to each other, and it doesn't even sound like there's a discussion there. You get a navigator who's listening to two followers talking and trying to complicate their lives by telling them they have other choices when maybe they're not ready yet. So sometimes these levels can confuse people because you need to know where the conversation is at. But I believe that everybody should be aspiring to level 2 at some point. So when somebody gives you a rule, it's not a rule, it's a tool, but it could be a useful tool. You could listen to it. You could practice it for a while as a rule and see if you get anything out of it. But it's not a rule, it's just a tool. What I'm going to show today are not rules in any way, shape, or form. They are tools. That's all they are. But some of you may know me to be a bit bombastic. If it weren't for hyperbole, I'd have nothing to say at all, ever, anytime at all. So if I ever phrase these in ways that sounds like rules, laugh at me. They are things you can do. They're not things you must do. Absolutely not you must do. They're not things you should do. They're things you can do, and here's how. And I'll try to show you some reasons why I do them, while keeping in mind that I'm mostly a pantser. I mostly just sit down and start writing whatever day is coming into my head next. So for me to be teaching you how to build models and outlines of your story may seem out there, but it's a tool. Sometimes it's the way I have to solve a problem. Sometimes it's just getting in my way. If those of you, i.e. one of you, who've ever worked with me as a programmer, are well aware that sometimes I just have to get in and start burning through code. And sometimes I have to sit and think about it. That's my approach to my writing, is sometimes I just got to burn through and sometimes I have to think. These are tools I use for the thinking. They are tools I hope you get some inspiration from and find useful. But they're not things I'm going to say, if you're not doing this, you're wrong. So this is how I've done this in the past with software development, is I just show up and I start modeling their system. I don't even know what their system is yet. I walk in the door and I start asking them questions and drawing pictures of what they tell me for answers. And pretty soon they start telling me where my pictures are wrong, and oh wow, we've got a conversation going. That's a more of a design approach than an analysis approach. For this week, we're going to do an analysis approach. We're going to analyze an existing story. So I am going to start analyzing an existing story by drawing pictures from that story. So I'm going to draw a picture with an element called a hole. in the ground. And I'm going to add elements. The particulars of how the tool works are just specifics to the tool. They're not part of the drawing process. Look at the picture. Don't fret too much about how I'm drawing it with the tool. Look at the results. So, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And we know some things about this hole in the ground. Come on. We know that nasty is no, because it's not a nasty hole. It's not a wet hole. We also know it's not. Come on. We also know it's not a dry hole. Nor a sandy hole. We know that what it is comfort. And I goofed. I put here for initial value of, no. All right. So I have, okay, ignore where it says int in there. That's an artifact of the tool. Elements. Show property types, features, show property string. Yes, show string. I don't remember how to turn this one off right now. Come on. Let's see if that's it. Nope. All right. So ignore where it says :int for you programmers. Of course, that's saying that it's an integer. But this is the opening paragraph of The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms, nothing to sit on or nothing to eat, dry bears. I don't have it quite memorized. I'm pretty close. But it was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. So these are things we know from that opening paragraph. And slowly building from there, we're going to start to build a world. Do you all see my mute and stop video and security and so on tab here? It's right in the middle of my screen. I don't know if it's in the middle of what you see.
No, it's clear.
No. All right. So it's as long as it's not bothering you, because I can work around it. So now it tells us that it had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green. And so I go back to my class controls. I wish these were all on one tab, but they're not, for reasons that make perfect sense to a programmer. So it's a door, and the color is green, and the shape is round. And it has a door, which means the hole has the door. The arrow indicates the direction of having. We could easily not have an arrow on either end to say these two are connected, but neither can be considered having the other. Let's see here. How did I get ahead of page already? Shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. So knob which is shiny, and brass. And the door has the knob. Okay. At this point, I'm being silly to a degree. It is not going to matter later on in the story. If any of you have not read The Hobbit, no, it is not going to matter later on in the story that the knob was brass. It will actually matter for this chapter that the door was green. But it's going to take a beating, that door. But I am not going to need to know what the knob is, but I wanted to demonstrate the idea that a hole can have a door, can have a knob, and we can know things about them which might or might not be useful in the future. I am right now analyzing this story, and I'm trying desperately to pretend that I know nothing about a book that I've read 23 times. So sometimes my future knowledge is going to kind of run into these diagrams, but I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum. If I am approaching a story, because I've done this for a few clients where they ask me to look at their story and try to do the model for them, to try to analyze and raise questions about the story. And so when I approach a story like this, I am literally approaching it with no concept of what's going to be significant in the future. I know for a fact that Bilbo's doorknob is, oh, I'm sorry, we don't know his name yet, that the Hobbit's holes, doors, doorknob being brass is not going to be a significant story element down the road. But early on in analyzing a story, I really don't know yet what is going to be significant. And I would rather overanalyze than underanalyze, because the analysis becomes a way of diving into the story in a different way from reading it. When I taught software development, I called this the outline effect. When you have knowledge and you listen to it or read it, that involves one path through your brain. When you make something with it, that involves other paths through your brain. And therefore, you're thinking about it differently and more deeply. When I am creating this picture, I am taking the words in, I am trying to understand relationships among them, and then I'm even trying to involve the visual elements of my brain, which is why the book Making Story Models is about visualizing stories. I'm taking those visual parts of my brain and involving them in the analysis. And I'm even, to a degree, involving motor skills, the motor elements of the brain, because I have to move things around to draw the picture. And eventually I will start organizing things, trying to say, I want to get a pleasing shape. And I think that maybe since the doorknob kind of isn't important, I'll move it someplace where it's out of the way, but I can come back to it later. Shaping these pictures, rearranging them until they're beautiful pictures that I want to share with the world, is also almost a form of meditation on their content. What's the important parts here that I have to emphasize? Are there parts that maybe I eventually pull the doorknob off this diagram entirely because it proves not to be meaningful? So that whole process of arranging is what I call the hotel room part of the process. Because back when I was modeling software systems for clients, I would go to a strange city, and they don't come stranger than Ann Arbor, go to meet with a client, spend all day modeling with them, and at the end of the day, they would go home to their family and friends and their activities and whatnot, and I would go back to my hotel room because okay, Ann Arbor's a bad example here. I've got 100 friends in Ann Arbor, but in general, I'm in a strange city by myself. So I've got nothing better to do at night in the hotel room than make the pictures pretty for tomorrow. And in the process, I get a whole second phase of learning. Arranging the pictures to make sense requires me to think about what makes sense within those pictures. So the door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel. Okay. I think the hall is probably going to be important. Coming off of the hole. A very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The Hobbit was fond of visitors. Okay, I could try to draw all of that, but at some point it becomes easier, especially with a $229 tool, to use text as text. Notice how Kindle cleverly includes the credit for it so that I can go back to say, where did I get this text from? That wasn't Enterprise Architect doing that. That's just Kindle makes sure that when you copy and paste, they include a credit line. The tunnel wound on and on. All right, I've got to hide this thing somehow. The bar is in my way now. Let me try taking it all the way to the top of the page. Okay. Tunnel wound on and on, going fairly, but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as people for many miles around called it. So we have another place, which is the hill. And the hill has the hole in the ground. And many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on another. No going upstairs to the Hobbit. Okay, this much text. I'm not drawing a map of the Hobbit's home yet. Maybe we will do it later. This Hobbit was a very well-to-do Hobbit, and his name was Baggins. Okay, now I can go back to my picture here and introduce a small bit of notation. And by the way, this is a bit of notation that my book, Making Story Models, never gets into. Not that the book is incomplete, but the book captures the simplest paths as opposed to what I might necessarily do in a real practice of analyzing or modeling. So you're seeing things that aren't in my book, which doesn't mean I'm not proud of it, just means that it can't capture everything I do. The concept here is what we programmers would call a class. Wait, before I do this, let's go back over here and show you my browser model of my model. Over here, as I'm drawing things, you see that they're all getting added over here, that we have a Hobbit, we have a hole in the ground, nasty, wet, dry, sandy, comfort, door, and so on. And notice that the Hobbit has got a shape here, and it's just called Hobbit. Now I'm going to go and do something here, which is I'm going to change it into an instance. Sorry, time to do some geek speak here. In fact, I'm going to do geek speak on top of geek speak. If I go over here now and look, we see we have Hobbit and we have :Hobbit. Hobbit now is what in programmer terms we would call a class. More generic synonyms in English would be a type or a kind. To say hobbits are a kind of creature, and this particular Hobbit, they told us, is called Baggins. Only I am going to sneak in a little foreknowledge here that I know he's Bilbo Baggins, and I don't want to have to change the name twice. So now this Bilbo Baggins :Hobbit tells us that Bilbo Baggins is a specific Hobbit that lives in this hole in the ground. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, blah, 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 blah. You could tell what a Baggins would say. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected, blah, 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 foreshadowing up the wazoo. The mother of a particular Hobbit, and then he goes off into the finally 3 pages in saying, oh, you don't know what a Hobbit is. I suppose some Hobbits need some description these days. And now here's where I once again am way too lazy to try to draw this as a picture, because some things just are easier in text. And so now I go and say, we have our over here, over here we have Hobbit as the class, the category And I want to open up the properties and say that here's what we know about hobbits. So I've just captured some knowledge in there that way. All the things about a hobbit. And then, as I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins, that is, was the famous Belladonna Took. So now what I do is I drag Hobbit onto this page again. And notice that I've just got an artifact in here. Because originally I drew a hobbit as having a line to a hole in the ground. And then I said, no, Bilbo has the line to the hole in the ground. But all of a sudden, Hobbit has a line to the hole in the ground. That's just a process of the way I drew it. But, you know, there are things called erasers, or in this case, delete keys. And I say, I'm going to delete that. Not all hobbits live in the hole in the ground. Bilbo lives in the hole in the ground, but not all hobbits live in the ground. And then I'm going to say that that hobbit I dragged onto there is also an instance of a hobbit. It is not hobbits in general. It is a specific hobbit, Belladonna Took. And we can argue which way this arrow has to go, whether it's from mother to son or son to mother. I am going to put it from son to mother because I, sneaking ahead, know that Bilbo is the protagonist and Belladonna will never show up in the story again. So I'm going to go in here and say that Belladonna Took, we are going to call the mother. And so you see that it added that label onto the arrow, onto the end of the arrow. I'm going to get lazy in the future, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this, where I can just double click and just type in the name. No, that was the diagram. And so I can type in some sort of name like the main hall. It's faster, it's lazy, but I'm all about being lazy if it helps get things done. The only minor difference is look at where the label mother is on this one, right next to the mother, so we know who it's applying to. With this one, it's in the middle. So you could have an argument over which is the main hall. I'm not going to have that argument. I'm going to know, and it's so many more steps to put the label on the end. So that was Belladonna Took, one of the three remarkable daughters of the Old Took. Come on, browser. So we need a hobbit called the Old Took. So make that an instance. Yes. Come on. Clicking the wrong things. The Old Took. And he, come on, is her father. Head of the hobbits who lived across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. So now we have the water that runs at the foot of the hill. It was often said, blah, 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 Took ancestors must have had a fairy wife, blah, blah, blah. Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father. Okay, we're getting a lot of hobbits on here. And if I had read this book before, I might know that Bungo also is never going to appear in this story after this line. Well, okay, after this paragraph or so. And I will draw a connection there. And sometimes I get lazy and in a hurry, so I don't bother labeling the connections and figure I'll remember them later. And sometimes I then have to laugh at myself because I don't. But I'm trying to give a useful example here, not get the entire family tree. But later on, I'm going to get a family tree or two where I'm going to take these elements and turn them into family trees and start asking questions. Okay. Under the hill, across the water, blah, 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 blah. More description of Bilbo that if I really wanted to, I could paste into the model in the text box. So by some curious chance, when there was less noise in my green, Bilbo was standing at his door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed. I'm not going to put the pipe in the picture because I just don't think it's important, and I will turn out to be right. And Gandalf came by. And right now, you know, if I had read this book before, I would draw a picture of a wizard coming by and call him Gandalf. So wizard would be the class and Gandalf would be the instance. But right now, they haven't told me that much. So I'm going to have Gandalf come by. And then it has a bunch of descriptions about Gandalf and how famous he is and where he's been and blah, 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 blah. Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. Okay. Something, just some instinct tells me that that staff is important. It's one of the very first things we learn about Gandalf is he has a staff. So I know maybe he throws it away in the next scene, but I think I'm going to capture that staff. He had a tall, pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, a silver scarf over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. I tend not to draw pictures of clothing. I tend to paste them in for description, maybe. Bilbo says good morning, and he meant it. Gandalf immediately becomes a jerk, questioning what he said. Bilbo tries to be pleasant, smokes some smoke rings, and Gandalf is once again saying, hey, gee, that's all pretty. I don't care. I have something more important to do. I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure. Now we have a goal. This diagram is getting messy fast. Again, when I get back to the hotel room, I will rearrange it into a pretty diagram. But find someone for adventure. Gandalf has a goal now. I will contend, tools not rules, feel free to come up with counterexamples, but I will contend that you don't have a story until you have goals. You have reasons why the characters are stepping out of where we find them in the first place. So, little quick reminders on notations. So we have boxes, which are things and places. We have stick figures, which are characters. We have big bubbles, which are goals. They are also actions that characters take in pursuit of those goals. They can also be reasons why they have those goals, motivations behind them. For now, the only one we have is a goal. This will get sometimes into really odd situations, such as is a robot a character or an object? And the answer is yes, because again, if you know me for a while, if you ever ask me A or B, I will always answer yes or C. So yes, a robot is an object, which is also a character, depending entirely on how you're working in the story. All right. So Gandalf wants someone to share in this adventure, and it's difficult to find anyone. Bilbo basically explains to him why he thinks this is a really bad idea, and he starts to try to ignore this strange man. So Bilbo's goal is ignore Gandalf. Some of these things are definitely getting in the way. All right, so he's trying to ignore Gandalf, but Gandalf is having nothing to do with it. Bilbo says, "Good morning, we don't want any. Try to move over the hill." Gandalf says, "Okay, now you want to get rid of me." And Bilbo says, "No, no, no." Gandalf introduces himself, and now Bilbo's like, "Oh, wait, I recognize you. I've met you before." He didn't know it until this moment, but they do have some past connection. He gave the old Took a pair of magic diamond studs, so Gandalf has in the past been associated with the old Took. Wonderful tales. Old Took used to have them. I won't bother putting the diamond studs onto the picture. You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to be and fond of flowers. Blah, 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 blah. Had no idea you were still in business. Where else should I be? And that is not without, indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake and for the sake of poor Belladonna. So Gandalf also has known Belladonna. Kind of makes sense if he knew the grandfather and he knew the grandson, he would be knowing the daughter in between. Going to take your leave, and is also going to send him on this adventure, which means now ignoring Gandalf doesn't work. So I'm going to do a little special notation on this. This is unique to me. You aren't going to find this on traditional UML books. UML, for those of you who aren't programmers, Unified Modeling Language. It's essentially a blueprint notation for software. And I am going to add on a minus sign. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to see it, but if you look really close, you can see the minus sign in there. The minus sign means this goal hinders this goal. So when you start seeing conflicting goals, more story starts emerging. So Gandalf's goal of finding someone for the adventure is conflicting with Bilbo's goal of ignoring Gandalf, because Bilbo has actually a real motivation, which is he likes his quiet life. And I'm going to use a special different arrow for that one. For you programmers, think of it as inheritance. UML calls it generalization, which means that liking his quiet life is the general principle. It's the motivation. It's the thing behind the scenes. Ignoring Gandalf is one part of liking his quiet life. Now, a note about the different arrows I'm using. If you can figure out my arrows, that's not a problem. I got to tell you, I've been modeling with some people for 20 years, and we still argue sometimes about the right arrow for a situation. And that argument turns into a conversation, and we both know more when we're done. So if you don't keep track of these different kinds of arrows and you just draw one kind of arrow for everything, I'm not going to tell you you're doing it wrong. But when I use a specific arrow, I'm going to explain why I thought that was important. And this is, as you'll see in my book, this is my general way of showing a goal and a motivation behind the goal. The triangle-headed arrow says, this is why he's ignoring Gandalf, because Bilbo likes a quiet life. Boy, I have this suspicion that Bilbo's not going to get a quiet life, since this is still chapter 1 of a moderately long book. All right, so he says, I'm going to send you on this. Very amusing, very good and profitable if you get over it. Bilbo says, don't want any. Please come to tea. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye. And so now here, Bilbo has an action, which is an invitation to tea. It's not a goal so much as a thing he does, and he does it as part of trying to ignore Gandalf. So actually, if I were doing this for my own work, I'd introduce yet another new arrow, which is the dashed arrow and the include, which says ignoring Gandalf includes inviting him to tea. I got to tell you, Bilbo ain't that bright. If you want to invite someone, if you want to ignore someone, inviting them back to your house, it could go wrong. But there's the invitation to Bilbo. Now, it actually, give Tolkien credit for it. Afterwards, he says, why did I ask him to tea? He'd only just had breakfast. And so he's like, why did I do this? I was that desperate to get away. And he shut it as quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards. Now, I think we've actually seen it earlier, but now we do know that Gandalf is, in fact, a wizard. So let us turn Gandalf into an instance. Go over here to our browser. And now we see that we have two Gandalfs. We have colon Gandalf and we have Gandalf the class. And I'm going to change that one to be wizard. And so now this says, hey, he's a wizard. And I say yes, and his name is Gandalf. Not Gandalf, Gandalf. And so we have the first scene out of the way. We have a somewhat messy diagram of everything we've learned in that scene, or the biggest things we learned in this scene, and some of the things are inside as well. Any questions on the process I followed to this point? No questions? You can also put them in chat. Nope, no chat. All right. So this is our process so far of analyzing a scene. I want to repeat this process a little faster on the next scene. So I'm going to go over here to my browser. Come on, browser. And say that I want to add another diagram. Which I will call scene 2. Actually, I'll call this one the unexpected party. And I won't go into an awful lot of details on here because good grief, I'm going to have to draw 13 dwarves and give each of them their name and so on and so on and so on. That's going to take a long time, but I do want to go back to the concept of objects on here, because at some point here in the process, we mention that we have Thror's map. And we have Thror's key. And that at the point where the scene starts, Gandalf has both of these. And eventually, I'm going to have Thorin. And yes, Thorin has to be turned into dwarf as a class and Thorin as an instance. And Thorin ends up with these. And this map starts out talking about the Lonely Mountain. The Lonely Mountain. And here's another case where I'm going to use a special arrow. And let me explain the reason for the special arrow, why I choose to use it. I'm going to use the dashed arrow which essentially means I know about this thing. The map isn't physically connected to the Lonely Mountain. The map just depicts the Lonely Mountain, which means it has knowledge about the Lonely Mountain. It has that knowledge, which represents things that people know, but it's not a direct connection. You could say, for an example, that I have a dependence on the state of Washington because I know where it is. I have my left foot because I better know where it is. A solid arrow is a strong connection. A dashed arrow is a loose connection. So the map depicts the mountain, but the map doesn't have the mountain. Now the mountain has the river running nearby. Which comes out the front gate. Kind of cool how the river comes out from the underground that way. And the river running eventually runs into Long Lake. And along the way, and I'm going to cheat now because I don't remember this. Horror of horrors, I don't remember this. Wait, come back here. Does it tell us where Dale is? Yes. Dale is alongside the river near the mountain. Somehow I had it pictured farther down the river. So there is Dale. So that is, I just accidentally connected the river to itself, which could have a valid meaning. I haven't run into an example of that right now, but so there's Dale. And eventually we will find many chapters later, we will find Lake Town, but on the map, at least, it's called Esgaroth, which was, I'm imagining, since of course I've never read this book, is on the side of the lake, whereas Lake Town will be actually built onto the lake. So they're not quite the same thing, but they're very close related. So along the way, what I'm starting to build here from that map is what I call in my book an abstract map. Because I got to tell you, I don't know about you, but this is when I fell in love with this book. I had my brother's borrowed from the library copy of The Hobbit, the old big green hardback edition, and I was stuck in his back seat of his car while he was in visiting with his girlfriend and her mother, and I had nothing to do and I didn't have my books with me. So I pick up this book that was on the floor of his car. How he could do that, I don't know. And I open it up and this map folds out. And that was it. I was in love. I love maps. This map folds out. I love maps. I really do. But when you're trying to model something, a map is a model. I mean, it is the definition of a model, a representation of something else so you can look at it and study it. But man, I could spend hours and hours and hours and not even get close to this level of detail on a map, much less more. So an abstract map is just the names that represent the places and the paths between them. And I can even do things like open them up and say, I'm going to have a great hall inside here. Okay. Some properties here. You don't need to see all of that diagram. don't show namespaces. What that was telling me was that, oh, come on. It shouldn't have to tell me that it's in the Great Lonely Mountain. I'm fighting with the tool now when I should be teaching you. So I'll fix that later. But has a Great Hall and it has a mine. And it has the back stair. And the back stair leads to the Great Hall. And from the Great Hall, you can get to the mine. This abstract map is really fast and easy to draw. And you can start doing things like saying, you know, from the front gate, the river running comes out, and maybe say that Dale is 15 miles down the road. And Long Lake is 50 miles down the road. I don't remember these distances at all. Pretend I know what I'm talking about. You can start doing things like putting distances and travel times on the connections on your abstract map. So that all of a sudden, if I want to say, okay, Bilbo is running out the front gate to Long Lake, how long is it going to take him on his little hobbit legs? I can start looking at these distances. I can start doing calculations. Can I, if Dale is 15 miles down the river, can you see it from the front gate? Well, the front gate's pretty high, maybe. So by creating this abstract map, you can start asking questions about things without having to go into this sort of loving detail, because man, I love maps. One of the proudest moments in my second novel was when the publisher asked for a map so they could give it to their cartographer. So the map of Maxwell's, or not my second novel, my third novel, a map of Maxwell City on Mars. And first of all, I'm a pantser. I kind of never drew the map. I built it in my head as I was writing the story. So I had to say, yeah, I'll get you one. But second of all, I used Campaign Cartographer 2, which is a map making tool originally designed for role-playing games, and built my map. And when it was done and I handed it to them, they said, oh, we don't need a cartographer. We're going to go with these. So I got to have my maps printed in my book. I also saved them the cost of a cartographer, so maybe that was part of their calculation. But my maps were good enough for professional publication. So you only think I'm a programmer and a writer. I'm actually a cartographer. No, I'm not. I'm not that good. All right.
The thing I love about maps is they're equal parts information and artwork.
Yes. And they're places where stories happen, so that combination can be inspiring.
And more than anything, like these arrows, they're about the connections between things, not necessarily the things themselves.
Mm-hmm. Dave Wolverton, one of my mentors, passed away, of course, a year or so ago. So we're still missing Dave. Dave had a very different approach to world building or to story building than I do. It was about as anti-pantser as you could get. He wanted the stories and characters to evolve naturally from the world. So he would literally design his world and his magic system and his cultures and his maps and everything, and then look at his world and look at places on the map and say, I've never really known what's happening in this valley here. Who would live here? And he starts developing a character that would live there and what their life was like and what living in that valley meant. Did it mean that they were snowbound 6 months out of the year or something like that? What problems does that raise for them? And a character would emerge in his head with goals and conflicts and challenges. And then he would start outlining the story of that character, starting from the map. I don't remember if I have ever started from a map, because I tend to come up with a character first, but I've often looked at a map and said, what could happen interesting there? And start figuring out a story happening there. So the maps are definitely how things connect, which is exactly what visualization gives you in general, is the connections between things. When I talked about modeling a customer's story for them, what I would do is, after I've drawn a pretty good analytical map of their story as they wrote it, and in one case it's been successfully published, so it was a good story that he was proud of, but he wanted to take it bigger into a novel. And he said, do you have suggestions on how I might go with this? And so, to understand his story deeply, because he understood it deeply because it came out of his head. I don't understand it as deeply. I need to put it in my head. So I drew the pictures and then started looking at them saying, what questions does this picture raise for me? Are there connections I'm not seeing? Are there elements I'm not seeing? And I proceeded to give him a list of 20 questions raised by, in that case example, there were 5 different diagrams I drew of scenes in his story. And I said, okay, here are 20 things that I think are worth exploring in this because they intrigue me. Look at these, and if you see any of them that get you started writing, then I think I have accomplished our goal. So the abstract map is a big element that I get out of the rest of chapter 1 of The Hobbit, which is the picture of the places in that map. And there's a lot more in here because we get mentioned the Mines of Moria. We don't know where they're at yet, but we get them mentioned. We get mentioned the dungeons of the Necromancer. We don't know where those are yet, nor who the Necromancer is yet. But these things get mentioned. This is a big part of how I do my analysis, both for stories and for software, is if they mention it, it goes into a picture, because that becomes a placeholder in my head of, hey, we've got the dungeons of the Necromancer here. I wonder what that's about. I wonder if I need to pay more attention to that. And boy, if they had paid more attention, they might have saved a few 100,000 lives a generation later. Or maybe not. Hard to tell. The Ring had a plan of its own. But getting these elements down there and letting me look at them pictorially gives me a different perspective on the story. I mentioned earlier the outline effect, that if I take the knowledge and turn it into something, I think about it differently and learn about it differently. The echo effect is if I take the knowledge and present it in a different form, it can often highlight unrecognized differences, where we both said apple and you thought I meant the fruit and I thought I meant the computer, and we proceed to go out shopping for apples, and you've gone off to the fruit stand and I've gone off to Best Buy. Because if I had drawn a picture of the apple that I wanted, we would have both known what I want. Sometimes the best way to work around synonyms and overloaded terms is to do the same terms in a different form, and pictures are one different form. I could have certainly instead just described verbally. So I say I want an apple, you say, okay, so you want the round red ones, the smooth ones, or do you want the crinkly green ones, or do you want the little tiny ones? And I'm like, crinkly green computers? So the pictures can also serve as an echo effect of highlighting misperceptions or just highlighting alternate perceptions. Okay. And again, I have another version of this, which has got all 13 dwarves on it and all sorts of other stuff going on it. But the most important additional pieces that aren't on this yet is that Thorin has a goal, which is reclaim the Lonely Mountain. And that goal has a motivation behind it, which is the entire story. Lonely Mountain. Because it's a lot bigger than his goal. And in the course of chapter 1, he tells that story. And in the course of telling that story, of course, dumps a big amount of background on you. And does it in a somewhat narrative, entertaining way, so you don't entirely mind the big info dump, but which also tells us a lot we're going to need to know later, and gives me an opportunity to talk about a different sort of diagram. Now, because I'm coming from a UML background, for historical reasons, I'm going to call this an activity diagram. In my book, I call it a plotting diagram. If you want to call it a flow chart, I'm not going to argue with it. Just be aware that in the tool, it's called an activity diagram. And all activity diagrams, all plotting diagrams have a starting point, which is where we enter into this particular scenario. Come on. And generally speaking, they have an ending point, which is in fact, in this case, going to be the unexpected party. Now, when we get the chance to talk about this in more detail, we'll talk about cases, especially during story design, where you might have more than one possible ending point that you can foresee, and it's giving you a chance to look at it and decide which one you think is most interesting. But since we're analyzing an existing story, which is already done, we will have one endpoint out of this story. Now, we could say, okay, we go from the fact that there's a mountain to the unexpected party. That would take 0 words on the page and would be kind of pointless. We don't want to draw that. What we want to draw is the steps from way, way, way back when to the unexpected party as Thorin describes them. And I'm going to skip a big chunk of them. Where'd my Kindle go? Oh, there it is. I walked right past it. We're going to skip a whole bunch of these and just hit the highlights. Come on. I'm clicking the button. I really am. Okay. Try to get back here. All right. Big party with the dwarves. Yay, yay. Dwarvish singing. Yay, yay, yay. There's a lot of clues hidden in that dwarvish singing, but we're going to ignore it for now. And we're going to get straight to Thorin telling his story. Gandalf, or Bilbo, has his little fainting spell. Mention of Mirkwood, a whole bunch of new things for the map. And the map and the key, front gate. Okay. Grandfather Thor's time, family was driven out of the far north. Driven out of far north. I hate this, by the way. I don't want them to be great big rounded boxes like this. I want them to be little capsule shapes. I don't need them to take up so much space. The default, which I haven't found a way to change yet in the tool, is the great big box shapes. There are ways I can change them after the fact, but you're going to see a lot of great big boxes for no reason as I do this. Driven out of the far north, came back to the mountain, which had been discovered by my ancestor, Thrain the Old. So actually, mountain discovered. Thanks, Thorin, for telling the story out of order, so I have to change things around. Fortunately, I've got a $229 modeling tool, which is designed to support changing things around easily. If you're doing this with paper and pencil, it's a little harder. Get good with your eraser. Came back to the mountain, mined and tunneled and made huger hauls. Settled under the mountain. Summarize a lot of this stuff. Grew immensely rich and famous, king under the mountain, gradually spreading up the river, running rivers, the valley, built the town of Dale. So Dale is going to become important. I just know it. Blah, 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 blah. Skip way ahead. Drew Smaug's attention. Smaug laid waste. Rain, Roar, Thorin, and others escape. Get these out of here, make some room. I can actually scroll, resize, and lots of other things, but I'm keeping it simple for now. Escape, spelled it wrong, who cares? Apparently I care. Okay. So we start to see some things going on in sort of a track of the plot. I'm going to throw in a piece of notation that is not in my Making Story Models book, which is for parallel plot lines. That after they escape, there are the years of wandering, which is Thorin's story. But then Gandalf pipes in to tell a different story, which is happening roughly the same time, which is Thror tries to reclaim mountain. Because these two are happening at the same time, I use this special symbol, they call it a fork, because the story forks there. Though while most of them were wandering, Thror tries to reclaim the mountain. Silly Thror gets captured by Necromancer. Gandalf discovers Thror. Oh, that's why I can't see it. There's another stupid zoom thing in my way. There we go. I was looking for my scroll bar. I couldn't find it. So Gandalf discovers Thror. Thror gives the map and key. But Thror is so far gone that Gandalf doesn't even know who he is at this point. So Gandalf searches for the sun and connect a whole bunch of these up. And eventually, Gandalf, we have the opposite of a fork, which is a join. Gandalf figures out who it is and meets up with the wandering dwarves. And Thorin asks for help finding a 14th party member because 13 is unlucky. Gandalf tries to enlist Bilbo, which leads us to the unexpected party. And man, no matter where I put these zoom things, they're in the wrong place when I try to do something else. Let me try to pan and zoom. Let me zoom out. And it's even at maximum zoom out, it barely fits. I'd have to do a lot of resizing and fitting in, but I've started to get a basic picture of the plot line told in this. Now, obviously, this is mapping an existing plot. Let's sneak ahead to what we will be talking about later, which is zoom back to 100%. Is because I mentioned that these are kind of like flowcharts, we could talk about alternate plots. So we have Smaug laying waste. No, not the map there. So the condition on this is dwarves dead. But let's suppose we're going to have the audacity to rewrite a classic that has been around for, I think, longer than all of us have at this point. We have the audacity to say dwarves wage war. And we say that we're going to say that this path is the case of a counterattack. Now, because of my experience with these diagrams from software development, you'll notice I'm putting square brackets around these labels on these arrows. That means it's a condition. In the condition where the dwarves make a counterattack, we go into waging war, and then I could go and design an entirely separate plot off of that branch. Off of Smaug laying waste. In the condition where the dwarves are dead, this is what happens. But in the condition where they counterattack, this is what happens. And so it lets me think about what the story might have been. In my book, I call these Murphy points. I draw the basic plot of how it ought to go if the characters are getting everything their way, or the way it kind of linearly is in my head is this path through all these steps. And then the Murphy game is I look at every single one of these steps and ask myself, what could go wrong? And if you're a writer, you can imagine something could go wrong at just about every step. And then I ask, is that interesting? So settling under the mountain, what could go wrong is, they find the Arkenstone early and an entire dwarven feud breaks out over control of the Arkenstone, and we never get around to the story of the dragon because we're so busy with this story of the dwarven civil war. So using these as a thought process as I model the story for design purposes is a really cool way of not committing to any one path before I thought of, could I make this story better? Orson Scott Card has an exercise he likes to run the students through. If you've been at Writers of the Future workshop, you may have seen this. If you're going to the workshops in the future, you may see this. And I'm sure he has a name for it. And I just don't remember what it is, something like 1,000 stories. And he does this with audiences. He loves to do this, especially with school kids, because he's trying to get them excited about storytelling early. Where he says, again, he calls it something like 1,000 stories. I just think of it as, no, go deeper, because that's what he keeps telling them. So he says, okay, we're going to tell a story. So who's the story about? And because it's a bunch of young kids, there's a reasonable chance they're going to say something either they've seen in a story or something for their lives, such as a kid. No, go deeper. Tell me more about the kid. A teenager. Okay, go deeper. A teenage girl. Go deeper. A teenage girl who's a babysitter. Oh, okay. So she's got something she's doing. So she's babysitting. Yep. No, go deeper. She's babysitting a brat. Okay, go deeper. Well, she's babysitting a brat who's trying to burn the house down. Well, no, go deeper. She's babysitting a brat who has set the house on fire already. Oh, okay. So what she's going to do about that? She's going to call the police. No, go deeper. Make it harder for her. His whole point is to take generic ideas, and there's nothing wrong with generic ideas as idea seeds, but start saying, what if it's more complicated than that? Go deeper. And he does this with them for 20 minutes. And at the end of 20 minutes, they have a really complex little story that none of them had imagined beforehand, because they're doing modeling, only they're not doing visual modeling, they're doing verbal modeling. But one of the big advantages of modeling, which is one of the big reasons why a lot of people outline, is it lets you explore paths quickly and reject paths quickly. If I make a model of a jet to put in a wind tunnel, it's going to take me, if I'm a really skilled modeler trying to do a really good job, it might take me weeks to a month to build a really good model of that jet. If I want to build the actual real jet, it's going to take me 3.5 years, not counting all the committee meetings and design reviews and government regulations and. So the benefit of an outline of a model is you can explore ideas quickly and find ones that interest you. That doesn't mean you're tied to those ideas when you start doing the actual work, but it's sort of a scouting expedition that you have been able to go through and scout out possibilities and quickly eliminate obviously wrong paths. Now, as a confirmed pantser, my general approach is almost the exactly opposite approach. If I took a path, it wasn't wrong. That path is the story. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but that path for me is the story. In my third book, The Last Campaign, I proudly posted a review that I got. I think it was from Library Journal. It was from a fairly respectable journal, from a respectable reviewer who talked about my meticulously plotted murder mystery. And I did not object. I did not complain, but I laughed my head off. Because there was literally a point in that book, roughly kind of in the middle, where I said to myself, Rosie's having too much good luck. Rosie is the chief of police of the Maxwell City on Mars. Rosie's having too much good luck. Things are going too easy for her. Readers don't sympathize when a character's having things easy, and the story gets over too soon if things are easy. Readers sympathize when there are challenges and surprises that don't fit with anything that they were expecting. And so I need something. What I really need is at this point in the story, I need another murder. It wasn't a plan. It was, I need another murder. Okay, who can I kill? Well, it has to be, this is to me a principle of mystery writing in general, is you can start with a murder of somebody that has no particular importance to get you in, but murders later on have to be someone that are significant to the reader. If it's not, if it's going to be a complete stranger, then figuring out who that stranger is and how they're connected had better be a big part of the mystery. But I wanted to murder somebody who was important to the reader already, important to the plot. I said, well, I can't kill Rosie. She's my protagonist's first person. I'm stuck with her, and I don't want to kill her off. I can't kill Nick, her husband, even though sometimes I feel like he deserves it, because if I do that, 1,000 readers are going to string me up, because as difficult as the man is, readers love him. I can't kill this. I can't kill. I'm going through all these reasons for people I can't kill. And then I said, wait, I could kill this guy. And I said, you can't kill him. He's the red herring. All the readers at this point are going to think he's the murderer. And I said, yeah. So if I kill him, all their favorite theories have just been tossed over and they've got to start over again. And I killed him in a scene. Rosie doesn't know why he's dead. The readers don't know why he's dead. And I don't know why he's dead. But that was my story going through. And eventually, his death became the crucial clue to the final climactic scene of the book. But I didn't know it at the time. That's typical Pantser. The outliner theory, though, is that you can go through 100 bad paths in less time than it takes to finish the one good one. So go through the bad paths, figure out why that's not where you're going, and end up with the one you really kind of like. So you can use these plotting diagrams as a way to trace alternate paths through what you're working on. Questions on the plotting diagram? I do want to add one more thing. Let's get rid of this. We're not going to have our alternate paths. I do want to add one more thing on this kind of diagram. If you try to do it for a whole book, it's your book is too complicated for any one diagram. But sometimes what you can do is grouping. And I grouped this diagram when I drew it before into 3 major areas: before the dragon, the dragon arrives, and after the dragon. And I redrew my paths entirely. Come on, redo my paths entirely, that it's from here to before the dragon, from here to the dragon arrives, from here to after the dragon, and from here to the unexpected party. And then I did something which made me really kind of happy to have the $229 tool that I have, which again doesn't mean that I necessarily think you should spend that kind of money. I came over here and said that captured by the necromancer happens after the dragon. Asking for help finding number 14 happens after the dragon. Drawing Smaug's attention. I will call that part of the dragon arrives. Arguably, it was before. Driven out of the north, that was before the dragon. Dwarves wage war, we're going to get rid of that one. That was a path we're not going to actually follow. So I'm going to delete it entirely. The founding of Dale was before the dragon. Gandalf discovers Throw, there's a typo. That was after the dragon. The mountain discovered was way before the dragon. Settled under the mountain was before the dragon. Smaug laid waste was when the dragon arrives. There's a lot more that I would actually draw on that picture because he described it in wonderful detail. Others escape was after the dragon, although it could take an argument if it was during. Dragon arrives, we got that. Gandalf searches for Sun was after the dragon. Thor gives him the map and key was after the dragon. Thor tries to reclaim the mountain was after the dragon. Tries to enlist Bilbo was after the dragon. Years of Wandering was after the dragon. And then I go into after the dragon and I say, you know what I would like? I would like a diagram. And I grab all of these and drag them and drop them on here. Apparently, I didn't finish the connections on some of these. Asks for help. Captured by the necromancer. So, Years of Wandering. Oh, that's right. It didn't get my fork and join in there for some reason. The tool is not perfect. So that's why some of these are disconnected. Because you notice we don't see over here in the browser. The fork and join were not on here to move around. So I'd have to do a little redrawing. But notice how much of my picture it already knows because the connections between these are actually part of the underlying knowledge in the model, not just part of a picture. This is why I kind of like this tool, even though it's expensive. And for software, I have to have these capabilities anyway. Also, it kind of can be forgiven a little bit for its stupid big bubbles because I can do a Control A to select them all and a Control Up to shrink them all at once and a Control Left to shrink them horizontally. So it's a pain that they're all bigger than I want them, but it's not that hard after the fact to fix them all. Now let's go and say asked for help finding. That was actually Years of Wandering, Thor, there it is. And yeah, those pieces need to be connected up again by the fork and join. So they escape. We have our fork. We have this goes to the Years of Wandering, but it also goes to Thor trying to reclaim the mountain. We have our join. So Gandalf searches for the sun. Years of Wandering. And asks for help finding. So I The forks and joins are unfortunate. They misbehave in that way, but other than that, it's pretty good. And in fact, I could even, if I'm really lazy and foolish, I can go up here and say, you know what? Why don't you lay it out? Well, for one thing, it laid it out exactly backwards from bottom to top instead of top to bottom. That's actually a setting in the tool, so I could change that so I get the top to bottom, which is how I would have preferred it. For another thing, it's got weird bends in some of the lines for reasons I don't know. But sometimes it's just faster to say, you know, try it. Go ahead and try it. Just let's show it what it wants, because it's a simple undo to go back to what I had. So let it try. Maybe it works. So there's more power in a tool. Another thing in here is I can make an edit, because it's not just pictures, it's underlying information, an underlying model, which I can say, you know, this is centuries of wandering. And when I go back to this picture, it's, where is it? Centuries of wandering, because I'm editing the underlying piece, not the whole thing. Now, since I've already got my big 3 elements on here, I want to just clean this up. We don't need all of these on this picture because we've got them on the other picture. So now I could start to create sort of a big map of scenes, or even of chapters, or even of books. And I could take these big maps, or these big diagrams of chapters and scenes, and break them down. Let's suppose that I wanted to add on to here, road goes ever on, that they take off and run, and say that after the dragon, we're actually coming out to here, that we're going to say, let's go straight to roads go ever on, and put a child diagram inside of that, which is an activity diagram. And I could start with saying, okay, Bilbo wakes up in the morning. So I could start with a big plotting diagram with the major elements of my plot, and turn around and dig in to each element and plot it out that way. I am more likely to start with something like this, with characters and goals, and each goal can have a picture inside of it of what happens when they try to carry the goal out. I spend a lot of time in the book on these goal diagrams and alternative ways to draw them and things you might accomplish in them. And I spend a good chunk of time on not just the maps, but other sorts of object diagrams. So, but that's gotten us through chapter 1 of The Hobbit. And so let's now go to any more questions, because that's basically as much as I wanted to get done today. But I've got another 20 some minutes if you've got questions for things I didn't cover. Thoughts, ideas? Obviously, I would love it if you all bought 20 copies of my books and gave them out to all your friends. I am not expecting you to buy a copy of my book to get value out of this class. I am demonstrating and hopefully collaborating on building models, because obviously I hope that this makes you excited about this to share with friends and to share the book with friends and so on. What I've got is a dilemma. Because, okay, we all need to get paid. We all have reasons why we do things for pay. I would love to sell lots of copies of this book. I would also love to spread the ideas in the book. And until you start seeing examples of it in use, you might not see a value to the book. So this is why I wanted to do these sessions where I actually do modeling with real people, with your questions, with your feedback, and try to say, here's an example of how I use this. And if you want to see the notation in more detail, see some of the thoughts behind it, that's for the book. But here, I'm more about sharing with you, hopefully get you excited so you see some possibilities, so you want to do more of this and maybe start spreading word of mouth to friends about what this might do for you. For you who are plotters, there's, I think, a lot of value you're going to see. For you who are pantsers, it's, yeah, I can see that, but I already don't write outlines. Now I cannot draw pictures too. Well, as a confirmed plotter, I'm going to tell you, sometimes I draw the pictures because something's just not making sense in my head that already happened. So I'll go back and analyze my own work. Or sometimes I want to look at another story that somebody else wrote and understand the elements of it. So creating a model of it helps me think about it more deeply. Questions?
Tell us a little bit more about your book, the reasons you wrote it, what in particular, if you hadn't written it, how would you be using it? A lot of the ideas that you raised, I think we had the same mentor, Dave Wolverton, and his ideas for very intense plotting, sort of standing at odds with your approach of pantsing. How would you use your book if you hadn't written it?
How would I use my book? I really tried in the book to walk through an example of the steps you would go through in modeling a story. And so I like to think that I would diligently read every chapter and try it myself. But I also know that I can be flighty and short attention span, so I'd probably jump around to things that interest me, or look at a picture and say, I wonder what's going on there, and then read that section because I just know myself. This actually, if you're a member of Dave's Apex Writers Group, this started out as a session for FireCon conference. The second time I presented this was as 2 consecutive sessions for Dave's Apex Writers Group. So this material got a lot of honing there. Because I've been doing the software modeling, so that's my natural way of thinking. I've been doing the software modeling since 1997. And it is the way I think about problems, often in my head, even if I'm not putting them on paper. In my head, I am thinking, what would those shapes be like? As it happens, my book was almost entirely dictated because I do most of my work dictation these days. And my company had a MULA. What does MULA stand for? Mandatory Unpaid Leave of Absence. As a cost-cutting measure, everybody in the company, the choices were, we're laying people off, or everybody takes 2 weeks off without pay and we don't have to lay anybody off. And the agreement was, we'll do the 2 weeks without pay. So I had 2 weeks with nothing to do, and my mom had passed away. I had no responsibilities at home. I did not yet have my feline overlords. They would come a month or 2 later. So I had no thing tying me down. So I got in my Jeep and drove up to Michigan's Upper Peninsula and drove around planning to work on dictating a story that I'd been working on. And halfway through the Upper Peninsula, I started getting the vision for this book. I always knew I wanted to make it into a book, but I started getting the vision for how I would do it. And so I started dictating this book while I drove. Anybody who's worried about me driving while dictating, it's just the way I do it. I know, but trust me, it's pretty safe. There are worse things I do in life. But obviously, while I'm driving, I'm not drawing pictures on paper or on the computer, but I was drawing them in my head and dictating what they should look like. So for me, as a very practiced person, yes, I can do these in my head. So if I need to solve a problem, I don't necessarily have to take it to paper. But the concepts of how to solve it were dictated over that time period to say, okay, here is an approach for teaching this, all these concepts that I want to get across. Here is an approach that I can do this. And then later on, as I tried to edit it into shape, I realized that I had parts 1 and 2 completely backwards. I was starting with the wrong one, and I was making the exact same mistakes in the new part 1 that I made when I started teaching software design. The exact same mistakes, which is I was trying to teach tools, not rules. I was trying to teach, here are all the pictures you can draw without the why, without a way of using these, not the way, tools, not rules. But if I didn't teach a way, no one saw a reason for the pictures. And so the way that I taught is a way I hope to go through next week in more detail, which is starting with characters, identifying their goals, identifying other characters involved in those goals, identifying their goals, identifying how those goals might play out, identifying conflicts between the characters because of conflicting goals, and slowly I am world building by accretion. Every time I look at a goal, I'm asking myself, why that goal? What's the motivation? What could go wrong during that goal? Who is going to be opposed to that goal? Who's going to be affected by it? Who will have to help? And so it becomes sort of I think of it sometimes as a sweeping process. And this is literally the way I design software too. I start with a single user, ask questions about what they need, ask questions about what we're going to do about that, ask questions about who's involved in that, ask questions about what they need. And by starting with that question of one person with one needs, I expand to define a whole system. And every piece of the definition is connected to some other piece or many pieces because they were discovered by asking questions about the pieces I knew. And that's sort of the process I try to teach in the book in part 1 is you're starting with a character and the character's goals. And we are driving through all of those to identify all sorts of elements of the world. And this would be essentially a similar concept to Dave's build the whole world and now start finding stories in it, except I'm building the whole world by starting with a character. Dave would often build the whole world by starting with a magic system or a culture or a religion or a political movement or something like that. And I think it's the last chapter of the book. I don't remember the chapters in my own book, but I have a chapter in there which is called Start Anywhere. Tools, not rules. There is no one right place to start as long as you start somewhere. And from that, learn new things and sometimes throw in things you haven't yet discovered. But I see it as starting in a place and discovering the things connected to the place and discovering connections to those, and by simply persisting at this, you build a whole world. And the reason why I have the Start Anywhere and part of that chapter is also an encouragement. And I have seen this forever in the programming world, especially trying to do designs. And I see it now in the writing world as well, but it took me a while to recognize it. People who don't start anywhere because they're afraid to start wrong. They are afraid that by starting in the wrong place, they're going to end up in the wrong place. They are going to end up wrong. And this is one advantage of models is it's just lines on paper. If they're wrong, you erase them. You haven't committed to anything. This is fundamentally the difference between plotting and pantsing is plotters on the whole are afraid of wasting time writing the wrong thing. Pantsers are not afraid to write the wrong thing. They just dive in and start doing it. And so plotters are trying to not waste time. They're trying to conserve their precious time. Pantsers are impatient. They want to discover what's the right story by writing it. Neither is wrong. It's a mentality. And I don't want to turn everybody into pantsers, but I do want to get people away from the concept of being afraid to start because I could start wrong. And when it comes to modeling, so what? It's wrong. You throw it away. How long did you really spend on the model? I think the longest I have ever spent on modeling a software system that a single person could write, because obviously huge systems that hundreds of people work on, that's a whole different world. But I think I one time spent 3 weeks on modeling a system that a programmer could sit down and write in the span of a few months. I spent about 3 days on that. 3 days is not a big investment, especially if along the way you discover, oh, wait, there's something horrible here. And this is much, much, much larger than we ever imagined. And by spending this 3 days up front, I save that time. That's the mentality that says the outline or the model will save us from being wrong. I consulted on one project where we sat down and spent a day modeling what they expected out of it, and no details because I don't know what the statute of limitations is on embarrassment. But when all was said and done, we'd realize with our model that the system couldn't be done. Not that the programming couldn't be written, but the real problem in the system that they were trying to fix was that users weren't following the rules to get jobs done that they needed to get done. And entering stuff into the program was more rules. And if they're already not following the simple rules, the idea that they're going to follow the more complicated rules just wasn't there. And there was a lot more behind that. But essentially, at the end of it, we realized this problem can't be solved by writing software. This problem can only be solved by hiring more disciplined, diligent, conscientious people, which means probably paying them more money. And the management is never going to do that. So all that's going to happen to the software team here is they're going to spend 15 months writing a system that does everything they were told to do and doesn't work, and the customer isn't going to pay them for it. And I don't know about you, but I can't afford to spend 15 months to not get paid. That's the mentality that says a plot will save you from wasting lots of time. And I'm hoping that I will show you a way to do lots of plotting and modeling to weave through the choices quickly to end up with ones you're really happy with. I think I probably just wandered about 300 miles from your original question, but did I get an answer in there somewhere?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So, yeah, one of my saddest regrets is I didn't finish this book in time for Dave to see it because he was very excited about it. He really thought that I had, in part two, I've taken a lot of what he taught with Farrell's triangle and with tri-fail cycles and so on, and I built on that and combined it with ideas from Vonnegut and combined it with my own ideas and others to end up with a real refinement on his teaching. And he was so excited to see that in Apex, and I wanted to get this book out, and then life took turns for me, and then we lost him. So
I think many of us share a similar regret, or a regret of a similar nature. Yeah. And similarly to Dave, I'm very excited to see what you came up with.
I'm appreciating that. Obviously, I hope everybody gets the book and loves it. But I felt like you need to see me do it to really appreciate what's in the book. Text is so static.
I like your comment about start anywhere. A lot of the stuff that I'm working on right now is I have these transitional circumstances. I'm effectively starting from the middle of the book.
Mhm.
And what I end up with at the middle is a short story that reads a great deal like THX 1138. You have a
Which is-
character you don't really care very much about who escapes from a bad thing, and that's the end. And it's a terrible story, but it's a great middle.
Mhm.
Now I have to make the characters into people you care about, and then I have to show the circumstances and the results of that at the end. But I start out with this what looks like rubbish in the middle, and I can see where I could use this modeling technique, particularly to flesh out the beginning part.
Mhm. How did he get here? What were the goals of the people that landed him here? What were the stakes they were arguing over, and so on. It's absolutely a start anywhere sort of thing, and a throw it away when you're done if it's not quite right, but it got you going. For those of you who remember your high school physics, I have a metaphor for these sorts of things. I also use the same metaphor when it comes to writing prompts. If you remember from your high school physics, it takes more force to start a block moving across the plane than to keep it moving. The difference between starting friction and sliding friction. Metaphorically, that's what many of these techniques are, writing prompts, models, and so on. They're to get your brain moving. If your brain goes moving and accomplishes something and it has nothing to do with that initial force that got you started, you still finish something. It can be very hard to get moving compared to keeping moving. In diabetes class, they taught us, I don't know if there's science behind this, so consider it a rule of thumb, except of course we don't have rules, we only have tools, so call it a tool of thumb. The tool of thumb is it takes roughly 21 days to establish a good habit. Round up, call it a month. It takes 6 days to lose a good habit. 6 days of skipping and you're starting over. I don't know if there's science behind it, but boy, that feels like how my life goes. That once I've got that month of doing it, I can keep it up. If I spend a week not doing it, I'm going to spend months not doing it. So I would rather do anything to get me moving, even if the thing getting me moving turns out not to be what I finish with. If a model gets you ideas and gets you going, and you eventually go somewhere else, you still went somewhere. All right, any more questions? Then I want to thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Am I still screen sharing?
Yes, you
Yes.
Yeah.
are. Thank you, Martin. I really appreciate it.
I am going to attempt, schedule permitting, to do this more times. Next week, I would like to do the opposite of analysis. Next week, I want to start with a character and goals and find a story. And we won't know what the story is because it won't happen until we get there.